She refused food to buy jewelries. The billionaire CEO saw it and made a decision that shocked everyone. Heat flooded Danielle's cheeks. She recognized that tone, had heard it in grocery stores when she counted out food stamps, in a school office when she explained why Marcus's field trip money was late again. The tone that said she didn't belong in places where beautiful things lived behind glass. Have you ever wanted something just for yourself so badly it made you forget everyone else? Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. She stood in that luxury mall with hunger gnawing at her stomach, clutching cash she'd stolen from grocery money to buy a diamond necklace. What the billionaire CEO did next wasn't charity. It was a test that would expose everything she'd hidden about survival, pride, and the cost of dreaming while broke. But the necklace was never the real prize. It was the door to a world where her deepest shame would become her greatest strength. Have you ever wanted something so badly you betrayed your own values to get it? Do you know what it feels like to choose between feeding your child and keeping a piece of your dignity intact? This is about the moment desperation meets opportunity and the price of saying yes. What would you sacrifice for a chance at the life you've only dreamed about? Hit that like button if you've ever had to choose between survival and self-respect. And let's discover what happens when worlds collide. Let me take you back to the moment Danielle's life split into before and after. She counted the bills 3 times, knowing it wasn't enough for both groceries and the necklace. But her hands reached for the jewelry anyway. Danielle pressed her sweaty palm against the glass counter, watching the diamonds catch the overhead lights like captured stars. Around her, the Atlanta Mall buzzed with afternoon shoppers. Women in designer clothes discussing weekend trips to Savannah, teenagers with credit cards their parents handed out like candy. The air conditioning blasted against her thrift store blouse, making her shiver despite the Georgia heat waiting outside. $347. That's what she had. The necklace cost $500. Ma'am, are you ready to make a purchase? The clerk's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp with impatience. The woman looked at Danielle's worn sneakers, the careful way she held her purse close to her body, and her smile never reached her eyes. Danielle's stomach cramped with hunger. She'd skipped lunch again, just like yesterday and the day before. Marcus would be getting out of school soon, expecting dinner that she couldn't afford if she bought this necklace. Her 8-year-old son trusted her to take care of him, believed in her when she promised things would get better. But this necklace... God, this necklace looked exactly like the one her mother had described in those bedtime stories. The one Mama said she'd buy herself someday when the bills were paid and life got easier. Mama died waiting for someday, her hands empty of everything except medical debt. I need a few more minutes, Danielle whispered, her voice barely audible above the mall's background music. The clerk rolled her eyes. We close in an hour. Heat flooded Danielle's cheeks. She recognized that tone, had heard it in grocery stores when she counted out food stamps, in the school office when she explained why Marcus's field trip money was late again. The tone that said she didn't belong in places where beautiful things lived behind glass. The mall's marble floors clicked under her worn sneakers, each step echoing like a countdown. Around her, shoppers moved with the ease of people who'd never counted pennies for milk, their laughter sharp against her silent desperation. A mother and daughter walked past, the girl begging for earrings that cost more than Danielle's rent. Her phone buzzed. Marcus texting from after-school care. Mom, can we have pizza tonight? Tommy's mom is bringing some for everyone. Pizza. Something so simple for other families, impossible math for hers. Danielle's fingers tightened around the crumpled bills. Maybe if she didn't eat for the rest of the week. Maybe if she picked up another cleaning shift at the hotel, worked until her feet bled in these shoes that were already falling apart. The necklace sparkled like a promise her mother never got to keep. Have you ever wanted something just for yourself so badly it made you forget everyone else? Drop a GM if you felt that pull. As the clerk's eyes narrowed with judgment, Danielle felt the familiar heat of shame, until a deep voice behind her said, I'll take care of this. She turned to find steel-gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe. The richest man in the room was the only one who recognized hunger when he saw it, because he'd worn it like skin once too. Richard Lawson stood 6'2" in a suit that probably cost more than Danielle's monthly rent, but when he spoke, his voice carried the roughness of someone who'd learned manners after learning survival. His gray eyes swept over the gathering crowd of onlookers, their whispered judgments hanging in the air like smoke. "Excuse me," he said to the clerk, his tone polite but carrying an edge that made everyone within earshot pay attention. "Is there a problem here?" The clerk straightened up, suddenly professional. "Mr. Lawson, no problem at all. This woman was just." She glanced at Danielle with barely concealed disgust, looking at items outside her price range. Danielle's face burned. She wanted to disappear, to run past the food court and out into the parking lot where her ancient Honda waited with the check engine light glowing. But something about the way this stranger looked at her, not with pity, but with understanding, kept her frozen in place. "I see." Richard stepped closer to the jewelry case, close enough that Danielle could smell his cologne. Expensive, but not overwhelming, like control power. "And which piece caught your attention?" "Sir, you don't have to," Danielle started. "The diamond pendant," he said, cutting off her protest gently. "The one that looks like your mother's wedding ring." Danielle's breath caught. How could he possibly know? But when she looked at his face, she saw something that shocked her more than his wealth. Recognition. The kind that came from shared experience, from knowing what it felt like to press your face against windows you couldn't afford to enter. The crowd around them had grown. Teenagers with phones out, recording. A security guard hovering nearby. An older woman in pearls shaking her head with disapproval. "In Texas, where I grew up," Richard said, his voice carrying to the gathered audience, "my mama cleaned houses for women who wore jewelry like this. She used to tell me that someday she'd buy herself something beautiful, something that proved she mattered." His eyes found Danielle's again. She died before that someday came. The mall fell quiet except for the soft music playing overhead. "What are you doing?" Danielle whispered. Richard smiled, and for the first time since entering this palace of marble and judgment, she felt like she could breathe. What I wish someone had done for her. But instead of reaching for his wallet, Richard turned to face the watching crowd. "What would you sacrifice for your dreams?" His voice carried through the space like a challenge. "How hungry would you get? How tired? How desperate?" The teenagers stopped recording. The woman in pearls looked away. "When was the last time a stranger defended you when everyone else was judging?" "Tell me about that moment." Instead of buying the necklace, he leaned close enough that only she could hear, "Meet me tomorrow. I have a proposition that'll make that necklace look like pocket change." His business card felt heavier than gold in her trembling fingers. She walked into his office expecting charity. Instead, she found a contract that would turn her life into a performance, her story into his salvation. The elevator climbed 40 floors above Atlanta, each number lighting up like a countdown to something Danielle couldn't name. Her reflection stared back from the polished steel doors. Thrift store blazer, shoes she'd polished until they almost looked new, hair pulled back in a bun that hid how badly she needed a cut. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman pretending to belong in a world that cost more per square foot than she made in a year. Richard's office occupied the corner of the building, floor-to-ceiling windows framing downtown Atlanta like a photograph. The Georgia Dome sat in the distance, dwarfed by the sprawl of a city that promised everything and delivered according to how much you could pay. "Thank you for coming," Richard said, rising from behind a desk the size of her kitchen table. Today he wore a different suit, charcoal gray with a tie the color of money. But his eyes held the same recognition from yesterday, the same understanding that made her stomach flutter in ways that had nothing to do with hunger. "Almost didn't," Danielle admitted, perching on the edge of the leather chair that probably cost more than her car. "This feels like charity." "It's not." He sat across from her, close enough that she could see the small scar above his left eyebrow, a tiny flaw in his otherwise perfect face. "It's business." The contract he slid across the desk was thicker than anything she'd ever signed. Legal language swam before her eyes, but the numbers at the bottom made her hands shake. $50,000. More money than she'd seen in her lifetime. Community outreach consultant, she read aloud. What does that even mean? It means I need someone who understands what it's like to choose between electricity and groceries. His voice was steady, professional, but something deeper moved underneath. I'm expanding my company's community programs. I need authenticity, not some college graduate who learned about poverty from textbooks. Danielle set the contract down carefully, afraid her sweaty palms might smudge the ink. Why me? Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Because yesterday, you were willing to starve for something beautiful. That kind of determination doesn't come from comfort. It comes from knowing exactly how much beauty costs when you can't afford it. The office felt smaller, suddenly, the weight of his attention making it hard to breathe normally. Outside, Atlanta stretched in all directions, a city full of people making impossible choices every day. What would I have to do? Tell the truth about your life. Help me understand what people in your community actually need instead of what people like me think they need. Would you trust someone whose world is completely different from yours? What would make you say yes to the unknown? The salary was more money than she'd seen in her lifetime, but the final clause made her blood freeze. Consultant agrees to full transparency about personal circumstances for authentic program development. He was asking her to expose everything she'd fought to keep hidden. She signed a contract with ink, but the real agreement was written in the space between what they said and what they meant. Danielle's signature looked small on the expensive paper, her handwriting careful and precise from years of filling out job applications and government forms. Richard watched her sign, something shifting in his expression that made her wonder what exactly she'd just agreed to. When do I start? She asked, sliding the contract back across his desk. Now. He stood, grabbing a jacket from the back of his chair. I want to see your neighborhood. Really see it, not the cleaned-up version politicians visit during election years. 20 minutes later, Richard's black Mercedes looked as out of place on Danielle Street as she'd felt in his office. The apartment complex hadn't seen new paint in a decade, and the playground equipment leaned at angles that spoke of deferred maintenance and tight budgets. Kids played around the broken swings anyway, their laughter echoing off brick walls tagged with graffiti that told stories no city council meeting would ever hear. This is where I live, Danielle said, suddenly seeing her building through his eyes. The cracked sidewalk, the security gate that hadn't worked since she moved in, the laundry hanging from balcony rails because the building's dryers ate quarters without getting clothes dry. It's home, Richard said quietly, and something in his tone made her look at him sharply. No judgment, no pity, just acceptance. Her apartment felt smaller with him in it, the secondhand furniture and carefully patched walls somehow more obvious under his careful gaze. But he didn't flinch, didn't look around with the barely concealed horror she'd seen on social workers' faces. Instead, he took notes in a leather journal, asking questions that showed he was actually listening. The kids in this complex, where do they go after school? Wherever they can find space. The community center closes at 3 because they can't afford staff. Healthcare, emergency room, or nothing. The clinic shut down last year. She made coffee on the 2-burner stove that came with the apartment, using the good mugs she saved for company that never came. The kitchen was narrow enough that when he moved to look out the window, his shoulder brushed against hers. The contact lasted half a second, but she felt it like electricity, her body suddenly aware of how long it had been since anyone had touched her, even accidentally. Sorry, he murmured, but he didn't move away immediately. She could smell his cologne again, could feel the heat radiating from his body in the cramped space. It's fine, she managed, though fine didn't begin to describe the way her pulse jumped when he was close enough to touch. The front door slammed, making them both step apart. Marcus burst in wearing his school uniform and a grin that lit up the dim apartment. Mom, you're home early. Have you ever shown someone your real life and feared they'd judge you for it? How did it feel to be that vulnerable? When Marcus came home and asked if the fancy man was her boyfriend, the silence stretched too long. Richard's answer surprised them all. I'm hoping your mom will be my friend first. But his eyes said he was hoping for much more. He'd built walls around his heart with money and power, but she knocked them down with a single question. What are you really trying to prove? It was past 9 p.m. when Richard finally looked up from the community survey results spread across his office conference table. Danielle sat across from him, her blazer draped over the back of her chair, sleeves rolled up as she worked through the stack of interviews they'd conducted that week. The office felt different after hours, less corporate, more personal. The city lights below painted everything in gold and shadow, making confessions easier in the half-darkness. These numbers are worse than I thought, Richard said, rubbing his eyes. 60% of families choosing between medication and groceries. That's just what people were willing to admit. Danielle circled another statistic with a red pen. Most people won't tell a stranger wearing a $1,000 suit that they're rationing insulin. He looked down at his clothes as if seeing them for the first time. It's not about the money. Then what is it about? The question hung between them like a challenge. Richard stood and moved to the windows, his reflection ghostly in the glass. Below, Atlanta glittered with the kind of beauty that only showed itself from a distance. My father left when I was 12, he said finally. Mom worked 3 jobs to keep us fed, but we still lost the house. Ended up in a shelter downtown, the one that got torn down to build luxury condos. His voice carried no self-pity, just the flat tone of facts delivered without emotion. I swore I'd never be that powerless again. Danielle set down her pen, studying his profile against the window. So you built an empire. I built walls. He turned back to face her, and in the dim light, he looked younger somehow. Vulnerable. The money, the company, the reputation, it's all armor. Keeps people from getting close enough to hurt me. Must be lonely in there. It was. His eyes found hers across the table. Until yesterday, the confession shifted something in the air between them, making the large office feel suddenly intimate. Danielle's breath caught as he moved closer, his expensive shoes silent on the marble floor. You're gonna mess up my life, she whispered. You already messed up mine. His voice dropped to something rougher, more honest than the polite tone he used in meetings. I can't stop thinking about you. The takeout containers from dinner sat forgotten on the side table. Chinese food eaten with silver forks, because that's what his office had available. She'd fed him a bite of orange chicken, laughing when sauce dripped onto his tie. The moment had felt so normal, so domestic, that she'd forgotten for a second how different their worlds were. Now, with him close enough to touch, those differences seemed both vast and meaningless. What's more attractive? Someone's success or their willingness to be real with you? Share your thoughts below. When the cleaning crew arrived and found them asleep on his office couch, her head on his shoulder, his jacket draped over her, the photos would be in the tabloids by morning. But for now, they had this moment of peace before the storm. The headlines called her a gold digger, but the real scandal was how much she didn't care what they thought when he looked at her like she was worth defending. The newspaper hit Richard's desk at 7 a.m. with the force of a slap. Billionaire's new charity case screamed across the front page, accompanied by a grainy photo of them on his office couch. Danielle's face was partially hidden, but her worn shoes and thrift store clothes told the story the media wanted to sell. They're calling you my latest acquisition, Richard said, his voice tight with controlled anger as he paced behind his desk. Like you're some kind of business transaction. Danielle studied the photo, surprised by how peaceful they looked together despite the chaos it was causing. Aren't I? You hired me, remember? Not like this. He stopped pacing, his gray eyes fierce. This makes it sound like exactly what it looks like to people who don't know us. She folded the newspaper carefully, her movements calm despite the storm building inside her chest. A rich white man and a poor black woman. They're going to write whatever story sells papers. By noon, the phones were ringing nonstop. Richard's assistant fielding calls from reporters, board members, and investors asking questions that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with judgment. The community center interviews they'd scheduled were canceled when word spread that cameras might show up. This is my fault, Richard said as they sat in his car outside Marcus's school, watching parents pick up their children. Some stared openly at the expensive vehicle, whispers following their gaze. I should have been more careful. Careful of what? Being seen with me? He turned to face her, his expression sharp with something that looked like pain. Careful of putting you in a position where strangers think they have the right to judge your life. The passenger door handle felt cold under Danielle's palm as she considered getting out, walking away, ending this before it got more complicated. But when Marcus ran toward the car with his backpack bouncing and his face lit up with excitement at seeing Richard again, she stayed put. Mr. Richard, did you see my science project? I got an A. That's incredible, buddy. Richard's whole demeanor shifted, the tension leaving his shoulders as Marcus climbed into the back seat. What was your hypothesis? As they drove through afternoon traffic toward her apartment, Marcus chattered about his day while Danielle watched Richard in the rearview mirror. He listened to her son with the same attention he gave million-dollar deals, asking follow-up questions that made Marcus beam with pride. Mom, can Mr. Richard stay for dinner? Marcus asked as they pulled up to the apartment complex. I want to show him my rock collection. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them had fully addressed. Staying meant crossing another line, moving from business meetings and charity work into something that looked suspiciously like a relationship. I don't want to impose, Richard said carefully. You're not. The words came out before Danielle could stop them, surprising them both. But fair warning, dinner's going to be spaghetti from a box and sauce from a jar. Sounds perfect. Camera flashes burst like lightning as they walked from the car to her apartment building, reporters having followed them from the school. Richard moved closer instead of away, his hand steady on her lower back, claiming her in front of the world, and every telephoto lens pointed in their direction. Have you ever been judged for someone you cared about? How did you handle the pressure? Let me know in the comments. The kiss came later, after dinner and homework and Marcus's bedtime story. In the kitchen while washing dishes, she turned to find Richard close enough to count her eyelashes. The argument about media attention melted into something desperate and hungry, months of careful distance destroyed in seconds. She'd spent years protecting herself from men who wanted to fix her, until she met one who wanted to learn from her instead. The kiss left them both breathing hard, foreheads pressed together over a sink full of soapy water and cheap dishes. Danielle's heart hammered against her ribs as Richard's hands framed her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones like he was memorizing her features. We shouldn't, she whispered, even as her fingers curled into the front of his shirt. Probably not. His voice was rough with want and uncertainty. But I'm tired of pretending I don't think about you every minute of every day. The honesty in his words broke something loose in her chest, some carefully maintained wall that had kept her safe and alone for years. She'd built her life around independence, around never needing anyone else to survive. But standing in her narrow kitchen with this man who saw strength where others saw struggle, she wanted to be reckless. Marcus is asleep, she said, the words carrying more meaning than their simple truth. Richard's eyes darkened. Are you sure? Instead of answering with words, she took his hand and led him down the short hallway to her bedroom. The space was small but clean, her double bed taking up most of the floor area. A single lamp cast warm light over walls decorated with Marcus's artwork and photos of family members who'd passed on but still watched over them. This isn't what I expected when I hired you, Richard said softly, his gaze taking in the carefully arranged space that held her whole world. What did you expect? A consultant. Someone to help me write checks to the right organizations and feel good about myself. He sat on the edge of her bed, looking up at her with an expression that made her stomach flip. I didn't expect to find someone who'd make me question everything I thought I knew about what matters. Danielle moved to stand between his knees, her hands resting on his shoulders. Through the thin walls, she could hear her neighbor's television playing late-night talk shows, the sounds of other people's lives continuing while hers balanced on the edge of change. I've never done this, she admitted. Brought a man here while Marcus was home. We can wait. I don't want to wait. The truth came out fiercer than she'd intended. I've been waiting my whole life for something that felt right instead of necessary. When he kissed her again, it was different from the desperate hunger in the kitchen. Slower, deeper, full of questions that had nothing to do with doubt and everything to do with discovery. His hands were reverent as they mapped the curves of her body, treating her like something precious instead of convenient. She undressed him with the same care, fingers tracing the muscles of his chest, the small scars that proved he hadn't always lived in boardrooms and luxury cars. When skin met skin, when breath became shared air, the differences between their worlds disappeared entirely. He touched her like he was afraid she might vanish, whispered her name like a prayer. She responded with a fierceness that surprised them both, taking control in ways that had nothing to do with desperation and everything to do with desire. Afterward, they lay tangled in her sheets that had never held anyone but her, the city lights filtering through blinds that needed replacing. Richard traced patterns on her bare shoulder while she listened to his heartbeat, slow to match her own. What does it mean when someone sees your struggles as strength instead of weakness? Have you experienced that kind of acceptance? As they drifted toward sleep in the early morning hours, 3 words formed in Danielle's mind that terrified her more than any headline or judgment. But saying them out loud felt like stepping off a cliff with no guarantee of landing safely. Love always costs something. The question was whether the price would be paid by her heart or her reputation. The second wave of media attention hit like a hurricane. By Thursday, every major Atlanta news station was running stories about the billionaire and the single mother, complete with aerial shots of Danielle's apartment complex and interviews with neighbors who suddenly had opinions about her private life. She always kept to herself. Mrs. Peterson from 2B told Channel 11, her face pixelated for privacy, but her judgment crystal clear. Seemed like a good mother, but you never know what people will do for money. Danielle stood in her living room, watching herself become a cautionary tale. Marcus beside her on the couch, asking questions she couldn't answer. Why are people talking about their family on TV? Why did the man at the grocery store stare at them funny? Why couldn't they just go to school and work like normal people? Mom. Marcus's voice was smaller than usual. Are we in trouble? Before she could answer, her phone rang. Richard's name on the screen, but when she picked up, his voice was strained with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. The board called an emergency meeting, he said without preamble. They're concerned about the company's reputation. What does that mean? It means some very rich, very conservative men think I'm having a midlife crisis and making poor decisions with company resources. Danielle sank into her kitchen chair, the weight of consequences she hadn't fully considered settling on her shoulders. The foundation project, on hold pending further evaluation of allocation priorities. The bitter edge in his voice cut through the phone line. 20 families were supposed to get assistance next month. The guilt hit like a physical blow. People who needed help, real help, were going without because she'd been selfish enough to want something for herself. Because she'd forgotten that women like her didn't get fairy tale endings without someone else paying the price. I should quit. Don't. The word came out sharp enough to make her wince. Don't let them win by making you disappear. But winning felt impossible when Marcus came home from school with tears in his eyes, talking about kids who'd seen their picture in the paper and decided his mom was the kind of woman who sold herself to rich men. When her supervisor at the hotel cleaning service mentioned concerns about the team's professional image during a shift that left her feet bleeding in shoes she still couldn't afford to replace. The school playground fell silent when she arrived to pick up Marcus, other mothers' whispers following her like shadows. But she held her head high. She'd survived worse than suburban judgment from people who'd never had to choose between electricity and groceries. That night, after Marcus was asleep, she sat on her fire escape looking out over the city lights that had once seemed full of possibility. Her phone buzzed with text messages from Richard, each one a variation of, "Are you okay? And we'll figure this out." But some problems couldn't be figured out with money or good intentions. Some bridges, once burned, left you stranded on opposite sides of a divide too wide to cross. When your relationship affects your children, how do you balance love and responsibility? Share your experiences. The anonymous letter arrived at her work the next morning, slipped under her hotel office door during the night shift. He's just slumming. Rich men don't marry women like you. But attached was a photo that proved the sender knew exactly where she lived and where Marcus went to school. She never needed a hero, but when someone threatened her son, she discovered what it meant to have a warrior in her corner. The photo was grainy but clear enough. Marcus walking out of school, his Star Wars backpack bright against the gray concrete. Someone had been watching her child, close enough to capture his face, his route home, the exact time he left the building each day. Danielle's hand shook as she called Richard, the hotel cleaning closet suddenly feeling too small to contain her panic. Someone's been following Marcus. I'm on my way. Richard, I can't. This is too much. My son is going to be safe. His voice carried a cold authority she'd never heard before, the tone of a man accustomed to solving problems with resources most people couldn't imagine. Stay exactly where you are. 20 minutes later, she was sitting in the back of Richard's car, watching Atlanta blur past, while he made phone calls that rearranged her entire world. Private security, new school pickup procedures, background checks on every adult who had access to Marcus's daily routine. This is insane, Danielle said, watching a man in a dark suit take photographs of her apartment building. I can't live like this. Marcus can't live like this. It's temporary. Richard ended another call and turned to face her, his gray eyes fierce with something that looked like controlled rage. My investigator is tracing the source of that photo. We'll find whoever sent it. And then what? You make them disappear with your money and connections? If necessary. The certainty in his voice should have scared her. Instead, it awakened something she hadn't felt in years, the luxury of safety, of having someone else willing to fight the battles she'd always faced alone. They picked up Marcus from school together, the presence of the security guard making other parents stare with new intensity. Her son climbed into the back seat chattering about his day, oblivious to the danger that had prompted armed protection. Mom, why is that man following us? Marcus asked as they drove toward a hotel downtown instead of home. We're having an adventure, she said, the lie tasting bitter. Like a sleepover, but fancier. The suite Richard had booked took up half a floor, with windows that overlooked the city and furniture that cost more than most people's cars. Marcus ran from room to room, his excitement echoing off marble floors while Danielle stood frozen in the doorway. I can't pay for this, she whispered. You don't have to. Richard's hand settled on her lower back, warm and steady. This is what having someone means, Danielle. You don't carry everything alone anymore. That night, after Marcus fell asleep in a bed bigger than Danielle's entire bedroom, she and Richard sat on a balcony, watching the city sparkle below. The distance from her apartment building felt vast, not just in miles, but in the life she'd built for herself through years of careful independence. I've never let anyone take care of me, she admitted. I know. His fingers found hers in the darkness. It's one of the things I love about you. The word hung between them like a bridge neither had been brave enough to cross before. Love, not attraction or affection or convenience, but the kind of feeling that rearranged priorities and redefined what mattered. How far would you go to protect someone you love? What would you be willing to accept to keep them safe? The investigator's call came at midnight with news that made Richard's face go hard as stone. The photos hadn't come from a random stalker or overeager reporter. They'd been taken by someone who knew intimate details about Danielle's past, someone with a personal reason to want her life destroyed. Every woman has a story she's never told. Hers just happened to be the kind that could destroy the man she loved. The private investigator's office smelled like coffee and disappointment, tucked into a building downtown that had seen better decades. Richard sat beside Danielle as they listened to details that turned her blood cold. Information that had been carefully hidden for 8 years suddenly spread across a desk like evidence in a trial. Derek Morrison, the investigator said, sliding a photograph across the table. Served 2 years for assault, got out 6 months ago. According to prison records, he spent a lot of time talking about settling old scores. Danielle stared at the face she'd tried so hard to forget. Older now, harder, but unmistakably the man who'd once controlled her life through fear and fists. Derek, Marcus's father, though her son had never known that truth. He's Marcus's biological father, she said quietly, the words feeling like glass in her throat. But he's never been a father in any way that matters. Richard's hand found hers under the table, his fingers squeezing gently. Tell me. The story came out in pieces, fragments of a life she'd rebuilt from nothing after escaping Derek's apartment in the middle of the night with a black eye and a positive pregnancy test. The restraining order that had expired. The address changes and job switches designed to disappear from a man who saw violence as love and possession as protection. I was 19, she said, her voice steady despite the memories clawing at her chest. Stupid enough to think I could save him from his anger, change him through patience and loyalty. It took him putting me in the hospital to realize that some people don't want to be saved. Does Marcus know? I told him his father wasn't ready to be a dad. Not technically a lie. Danielle's laugh held no humor. Derek never wanted a child. He wanted ownership. The investigator cleared his throat. He's been asking questions around your old neighborhood, showing people recent photos of you and Mr. Lawson, claiming you stole something that belonged to him. Marcus, Richard said, understanding immediately. And now he knows where to find us. Danielle stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked a parking lot filled with cars that had seen better years. This is exactly why I never told anyone about him. Why I moved across town and started over. Richard joined her at the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. He can't hurt you anymore. He doesn't have to hurt me. She turned to face him, seeing her own fear reflected in his eyes. All he has to do is convince a judge that a violent ex-con is a better parent than a woman who's sleeping with her boss for money. Family court doesn't always care about the truth. They care about stability, traditional families, people who look good on paper. The possibility hung between them like a sword. Derek couldn't physically harm her with Richard's security in place, but he could destroy her through the legal system, using her relationship and her past as weapons to take the one thing that mattered more than her own life. We'll fight him, Richard said, but even his confidence couldn't hide the uncertainty in his voice. The best lawyers, character witnesses, whatever it takes. With what? A relationship that looks like prostitution to people who don't know us. A lifestyle that went from poverty to luxury overnight. Danielle shook her head. You don't understand how this works for people like me. Women with histories, with mistakes, with children born outside perfect circumstances. Should we tell the people we love everything about our past? Or do some secrets deserve to stay buried? What do you think? The confrontation came 3 days later in the parking lot of Marcus's new school. Derek stood beside a rusted pickup truck, his arms crossed, and his smile carrying the same cruel edge she remembered from their worst nights together. But this time, she wasn't alone. Richard stood beside her, solid as a wall, while security kept careful watch from distance. Hello, Danny, Derek said, using the nickname that had once sounded like love and now felt like a slap. We need to talk about my son. She'd spent her life surviving other people's dreams, until the day she realized she could build her own. The family court judge looked exactly like what Danielle had feared, a white man in his 60s who'd probably never missed a meal or worried about rent. Derek sat across the aisle with a lawyer he couldn't afford, courtesy of some legal aid organization that specialized in father's rights cases. Your Honor, Derek's attorney began, my client is simply seeking custody of his biological son, who has been kept from him by a mother who has demonstrated questionable judgment in her personal relationships. Danielle's hands clenched in her lap as the lawyer painted her as a gold digger who'd used her child to trap a wealthy man. Richard sat behind her in the gallery, his presence steady and reassuring even though he couldn't speak on her behalf. But when her attorneys stood to present their case, something shifted in the room's energy. Your Honor, we'd like to present evidence of Ms. Williams' work in community development, specifically her role in establishing the Lawson Foundation's new community health initiative. The photos that went up on the courtroom screen weren't tabloid shots of her and Richard. They were images of her leading town halls, interviewing families, designing programs that would bring healthcare and resources to neighborhoods the city had forgotten. Her voice on the recorded presentations was strong, professional, passionate about helping people who looked like her, who struggled like she had. Ms. Williams didn't just consult on this project, her lawyer continued. She architected it. Every program, every resource allocation, every community partnership was designed by a woman who understood poverty not from textbooks, but from lived experience. Derek shifted uncomfortably as evidence mounted that Danielle had become far more than the scared 19-year-old he'd once controlled. Character witnesses spoke about her dedication, her intelligence, her fierce protection of her son's well-being. Furthermore, the lawyer said, pulling out Derek's criminal record, the petitioner served 2 years for domestic violence against Ms. Williams herself. He has shown no interest in his biological child for 8 years, only surfacing when Ms. Williams began receiving media attention. The judge's expression hardened as he reviewed the restraining order, hospital record from Danielle's injuries, police reports that painted Derek as exactly what he was, a violent man who saw people as possessions. Mr. Morrison, the judge said finally, do you have any evidence of attempting to contact your son or support him financially during the past 8 years? Derek's lawyer scrambled through papers that contained nothing useful. No birthday cards, no child support payments, no attempts at contact until the moment Danielle's picture appeared in newspapers beside a billionaire. The ruling came swift and decisive. Derek's petition denied, his parental rights officially terminated, a new restraining order issued that would follow him across state lines. Outside the courthouse, Danielle breathed free air for the first time in weeks. Richard's arms wrapped around her as Marcus ran up the courthouse steps, having been kept away during the proceedings. Is it over, Mom? Marcus asked, his 8-year-old face serious with worry he shouldn't have to carry. It's over, baby. She knelt to his level, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. Nobody's going to try to take you away from me. That evening, they celebrated at a restaurant Marcus chose. A pizza place with arcade games and sticky floors with a noise level made private conversation impossible. But watching Richard help Marcus with the claw machine, seeing them laugh together over prizes that cost a quarter, Danielle felt something settle in her chest that had been restless for years. What are you thinking about? Richard asked later, after Marcus had fallen asleep in the hotel suite they'd maintained for security. The foundation, she said, surprising them both. I want to expand it. Not just Atlanta. Other cities where families are choosing between medicine and groceries. His smile was soft with pride. Tell me more. What would you build if you had unlimited resources but had to stay true to your values? Share your vision. As she outlined her plans for a national network of community health centers, funded by Richard's resources but designed by people who understood need from the inside out, she realized something profound had shifted. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building something that would outlast them both, something that would ensure other women never had to choose between dignity and survival. Becoming a family isn't about blood or law. It's about choosing to fight for each other every single day. The baseball season started 3 weeks later, and Marcus had never been more excited about anything in his 8 years of life. Richard bought him a glove that actually fit, cleats that weren't from Goodwill, and a bat that didn't have electrical tape holding the handle together. You don't have to do all this, Danielle told him as they sat in the bleachers watching practice, but her protest lacked conviction. Watching Marcus run bases without tripping over shoes 2 sizes too big, seeing his face light up when he made contact with the ball. These weren't luxuries she could bring herself to refuse. I want to, Richard said simply. He's a good kid. He's been asking questions. About us. About you staying. She kept her eyes on the field where Marcus was learning to slide into second base, his uniform already grass-stained and perfect. He wants to know if you're going to disappear like other adults have. The weight of that question settled between them like a stone. Marcus had learned early that people left. His father before he was born, his grandmother who'd raised Danielle until cancer took her, even teachers who'd promised to stay in touch after changing schools. What did you tell him? That some people stay if you're worth staying for. Richard's hand found hers on the bleacher bench, his fingers warm against the evening breeze. And what do you think? I think I'm tired of waiting for the other shoe to drop. She looked at him finally, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his gray eyes. "I think I want to believe in something good for once." The conversation was interrupted by Marcus running toward them, his face flushed with excitement and exertion. "Did you see my hit? Did you see it go all the way to the fence?" "We saw everything, buddy." Richard stood to high-five him, and Danielle watched the easy affection between them with something that felt dangerously close to hope. Later, after showers and dinner and homework at the kitchen table that barely fit 3 people, Marcus looked up from his math worksheet with the serious expression he wore when processing big thoughts. "Mr. Richard, are you going to marry my mom?" The question hit the small apartment like a grenade. Danielle's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips, while Richard's pen stopped moving across the foundation budget they'd been reviewing. "Why do you ask?" Richard said carefully. "Because Tommy's mom said people who love each other get married. And you love my mom, right?" Out of the mouths of babes came truth that adults spent months dancing around. Danielle set down her coffee, waiting for Richard's response with her heart hammering against her ribs. "I do love your mom," Richard said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the confession. "But marriage is something grown-ups have to decide together." "Do you want to decide together?" Marcus pressed, his 8-year-old logic cutting straight through adult complications. Richard looked across the table at Danielle, his expression holding questions that had nothing to do with foundations or business partnerships. "What do you think, Mom? Do we want to decide together?" The apartment felt smaller, suddenly, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with its actual size. This conversation was happening over math homework and leftover pizza, in a space where the refrigerator hummed too loud and the neighbor's television bled through thin walls. But somehow that made it more real than any candlelit restaurant or romantic getaway could have been. How do you blend families when the circumstances are complicated? What made the difference in your experience? "Maybe we do," Danielle said softly, and Marcus's whoop of joy echoed off walls that had heard too little celebration over the years. When Marcus called Richard Dad for the first time 2 weeks later, casually like he'd been practicing the word in his head, the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred, but the moment was interrupted by a phone call that would test their newly formed family bond in ways none of them expected. They'd weathered scandal, survived threats, and built a foundation. But the real test came when success threatened to change who they were. 1 year later, the Lawson Foundation's Atlanta headquarters buzzed with activity that would have been impossible to imagine when Danielle first signed that contract. The converted warehouse in downtown Atlanta employed 43 people, served 6 neighborhoods, and had a waiting list of cities wanting to replicate their model. Danielle stood at the window of her corner office. Her office, a concept that still felt surreal, watching volunteers load medical supplies into vans that would make house calls to families who couldn't afford doctor visits. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now worked in a building worth more than her entire childhood neighborhood. "The Washington people are here," her assistant announced from the doorway. Conference Room B. The meeting that would change everything started like any other. Representatives from the Department of Health and Human Services, sharp-suited officials who spoke in acronyms and policy language that Danielle had learned to navigate like a second tongue, were prepared to offer federal funding for national expansion, the lead official said, sliding documents across the polished conference table. "Full program replication in 15 major cities, with you as national director." The numbers on the papers made her head spin. $50 million. A staff of hundreds. The power to change healthcare access for families in every state, to ensure that no child would grow up watching their parent ration medication or skip meals to pay for emergency room visits. "There's just one catch," the official continued. "The position requires relocation to Washington. Full-time residency, extensive travel, appearances before congressional committees." Danielle's pen stopped moving across the contract. "For how long?" "Initial appointment is 5 years, renewable indefinitely based on program success." 5 years. Marcus would be 13 when it ended, assuming it ended. High school, college applications, all the moments that mattered in a child's life. And Richard's business empire was rooted in Atlanta, his whole identity tied to the city where he'd built everything that mattered to him. That night, She sat on the fire escape of their new apartment. A compromise between her old neighborhood and his penthouse, a place where Marcus could walk to school and she could see her child at home from the roof. Richard found her there, 2 cups of coffee growing cold in the evening air. "You're going to take it," he said, settling beside her on the metal steps. "I haven't decided anything. You should take it." His voice was steady, but she could hear the cost of those words. "This is what you've worked for, what you were meant to do. What about us? What about Marcus's school, your business, the life we've built here?" Richard was quiet for a long time, watching the city lights flicker on as darkness settled over Atlanta. "I've been thinking about that. My company can work from anywhere. Oh, half my meetings are video calls anyway. And Marcus is portable at 8. Less portable at 15. The offer sat between them like a bridge to a future neither of them had planned, but both could see clearly. Success beyond anything Danielle had dared dream. The chance to impact policy instead of just implementing it. But it would mean leaving Atlanta, leaving the foundation that had brought them together, leaving everything familiar for something that felt both inevitable and terrifying. How do you stay grounded when life exceeds your wildest dreams? What keeps you connected to who you really are? "I'm scared," she admitted. "Not of failing, of succeeding so much that I forget where I came from." "That's impossible." Richard's arms settled around her shoulders, solid and warm against the evening breeze. "You carry that neighborhood with you everywhere. It's not a place you're from. It's who you are." The decision, when it came, surprised them both with its clarity. Not Washington or Atlanta, but something entirely different. A counterproposal that would honor both their dreams and their commitment to each other. A solution that had never existed before they were brave enough to imagine it. Some opportunities come once in a lifetime. The question is whether you're brave enough to redefine what opportunity means. The counterproposal took 6 weeks to negotiate and required lawyers in 3 different cities. But when Danielle walked into the Department of Health and Human Services for the final meeting, she carried documents that would change everything. Regional director positions? The lead official looked confused as he reviewed the paperwork. "We've never structured the program this way." "That's because you've never had someone who understood that real change happens at the community level," Danielle replied, her voice carrying the confidence she'd learned in boardrooms and town halls. 5 regional directors, each responsible for 3 states, each living in their assigned region and answerable to local needs instead of federal bureaucracy. The proposal was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of one national director isolated in Washington, 5 people who understood poverty from lived experience would oversee program implementation across the country. Danielle would take the Southeast region, operating from Atlanta while traveling to establish programs in neighboring states. "The cost differential is significant," another official noted, but Danielle was ready for that argument. "The effectiveness differential is more significant. You can have one person in Washington writing policies that sound good on paper, or you can have 5 people in the field building programs that actually work." Richard sat in the gallery section of the conference room, watching the woman he loved negotiate with federal officials like she'd been doing it her entire life. The scared, single mother who'd counted change for a necklace had become someone who could reshape national health policy with the force of her conviction. The meeting lasted 4 hours. When it ended, Danielle had official approval for a program structure that had never existed before, funding that would let her stay in Atlanta while impacting families across the South, and a title that would put her name on legislation affecting millions of people. "How does it feel?" Richard asked as they walked through the Atlanta airport, heading home from the final negotiation session. "Terrifying," she said honestly. 3 years ago, I was cleaning hotel rooms and rationing groceries. Now I'm going to be testifying before Congress about healthcare policy. You're going to be incredible. We're going to be incredible." She stopped walking, pulling him aside from the stream of travelers rushing toward their gates. "This only works if we're partners in everything. The foundation, the family, the future we're building." The proposal came later, not in a fancy restaurant or romantic destination, but in Marcus's bedroom as they tucked him in after a day spent at the groundbreaking ceremony for their second Atlanta clinic. The ring had been in Richard's pocket for months, waiting for the right moment that never seemed to arrive until Marcus asked the question that mattered most. Are you guys going to get married for real now that Mom has the important job? Richard looked at Danielle across their son's bed. Their son, because that's what Marcus had become through choice rather than biology. What do you think, Mom? Ready to make it official? The ring was beautiful, but not ostentatious. A single diamond that caught the light from Marcus's nightlight. It looked perfect on her finger, which still bore calluses from years of hard work and always would. Have you ever had to choose between love and career? How did you find a path that honored both? Share your story. As she slipped the ring on her finger, watching Richard's face transform with joy and relief, Danielle realized something profound. This wasn't the end of her story, it was the beginning. Everything that had brought her to this moment, every struggle and sacrifice and moment of desperation, had been preparing her for a life she'd never dared to imagine. But first, there was something she needed to tell them both, something that would change everything again. 5 years later, she stood in that same Atlanta mall, not as a desperate woman counting change, but as a woman who'd learned the difference between the price of dreams and their true value. The jewelry store looked smaller than Danielle remembered, its displays less impressive than they'd seemed when she'd pressed her face against the glass with hunger gnawing at her stomach. The clerk who'd once looked at her with barely concealed disgust now smiled with genuine respect, recognition dawning as she approached the counter. Mrs. Lawson, the woman corrected herself, clearly remembering the headlines from the society pages. How can I help you today? But Danielle wasn't there to buy jewelry. She was there with a film crew from CNN, completing a documentary about the Lawson Foundation's impact on Southern communities. The same mall that had witnessed her lowest moment would now be the backdrop for a story about transformation. Not just hers, but the hundreds of families who'd benefited from programs born out of one woman's refusal to accept that survival was the best she could hope for. This is where it started, she told the interviewer, gesturing toward the jewelry counter that looked so different now. Not the love story. That's a fairy tale people like to tell. This is where I learned the difference between wanting things and building value. The diamond necklace still sparkled in its case, price tag unchanged, but it looked smaller somehow. Pretty, but not powerful. Not compared to the framed newspaper article on her office wall. Lawson Foundation programs reduce emergency room visits by 40% in targeted communities. Not compared to the letters from mothers who could afford their children's asthma medication, for fathers who'd received diabetes treatment before emergency hospitalization. The real story isn't about a rich man saving a poor woman, Danielle continued, her voice steady and sure. It's about two people who recognized that they could build something together that neither could create alone. Later, at the Foundation's 5th anniversary gala, she stood at the podium looking out over a crowd that represented everything she'd learned about the complicated relationship between money and meaning. Board members in evening gowns sat beside community volunteers in their Sunday best. Politicians who'd initially opposed their programs now took credit for their success. Families who'd been helped by Foundation services shared tables with donors who'd made it possible. Richard sat at the head table with Marcus, now 13 and growing into the kind of young man who understood that privilege meant responsibility. Their daughter Sarah, named after Danielle's mother, slept in Richard's arms, 18 months old and blissfully unaware that she'd been born into a world her parents had fought to change. 5 years ago, Danielle began, her voice carrying to the back of the ballroom, I thought the best I could hope for was survival. I thought dignity was a luxury I couldn't afford, that dreams were for other people with different circumstances. She found Richard's eyes across the crowd, seeing in them the same love that had sustained them through media scandals, family court battles, and the complex work of building something meaningful from the ground up. But here's what I learned. The most dangerous poverty isn't financial. It's the poverty of expectations. When we tell people that their circumstances define their possibilities, we rob them of something more valuable than money. We rob them of hope. The applause was sustained but polite until she continued. The Lawson Foundation doesn't hand out charity. We invest in dignity. We don't rescue people. We recognize the strength that was always there and provide resources worthy of that strength. As the evening wound down, Danielle found herself on the hotel's rooftop garden with Richard, Sarah finally asleep in the portable crib they'd brought up from their suite. The Atlanta skyline spread below them, lights twinkling like promises in the darkness. "Any regrets?" Richard asked, his arm warm around her shoulders. "Just one," she smiled, leaning into his solid presence. "I wish I'd been brave enough to believe in us sooner." "We had perfect timing," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Everything happened exactly when it was supposed to." "So what would you do if someone saw your worth before you believed in it yourself? Would you run? Or would you build something that lasts?" Comment below with what you would have done in her shoes. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories that make you feel, think, and maybe even heal a little. Tell me in the comments what aspect of their journey resonated most with you. And remember, the most powerful love doesn't rescue you from your life. It recognizes the strength that's been there all along.